Thoreau that was actually, in his own way, deeply curious, wary but curious about technological inventions. I want to stress the way that for Thoreau it was the ends, the purposes to which machines were put that mattered. Second, I want to show how Thoreau's language dovetailed with two particular aspects of the abolitionist imagination. First, its tendency to describe collaborators as tools, and its critique of depersonalization, what Martin Luther King Jr. would later call the thingification of slavery. I hope to suggest this tells us something about the abolitionist imagination, about the ways that rather than being some sort of bourgeois social reform rooted in the imperatives of market life, that abolitionism actually drew moral energy from some critiques of industrialization. And I hope to place the theory of civil disobedience in this particular concern over mechanization and industrialization. Okay, so I'm going to start with this first topic, which is sort of Thoreau and machines, Thoreau and tools. So first, I want to sort of dispel a myth. Thoreau was not a complete Luddite opposed to all mechanical innovation. Our first image of him, of course, is a patient observer of the wonders of nature, and the second as a prophet of civil disobedience. Perhaps our third, or maybe our fourth, should be a curious, if critical, observer of technological innovation and capitalist development. One of the first publications he ever wrote was a bemused but not entirely critical review of Paradise Within the Reach of All Men. This is a sort of a book by this German author, J.A. Etzer, a book that sort of imagined what at the time was a kind of science fiction future of complete technological control over nature. The subtitle of the book, by the way, is It's Paradise Within the Reach of All Men Without Labor by Powers of Nature and Machinery. In this review, Thoreau wondered whether there is a transcendentalism in mechanics as well as in ethics. To his brother in 1838, he mentioned that he was reading Jacob Bigelow's Elements of Technology. This is a, sorry, a little bit of the slide got cut off, but this is just an image from that book. And in 1850, he took out from the Concord Library Appleton's Dictionary of Machines, Mechanics, Engine Works, and Engineering, the premier guide for the self-educated mechanic. You can see some of the engravings. I just kind of picked some pages sort of at random. So the middle one here, hydrodynamics, just took an extract of that from his into his commonplace book when he was reading them. And these books are kind of these remarkable, like the Appleton's book is like 2,000 pages of these, basically teaching people in an era when very few people, of course, got technical education. This is how you make these various devices. An 1849 letter to George Augustus Thatcher is an even more remarkable in revealing his curiosity about mechanical innovation. Thatcher's son was interested in becoming an engineer. Thoreau encouraged him and recommended that he read Bigelow's Technology. Moreover, he told him to visit machine shops of all kinds. It should be the part of every man's education today to understand the steam engine. In fact, as he told Thatcher, he had recently spent the day at the Hinckley and Drury, if I'm saying that correctly, locomotive works in Boston. I went into it and knowing the principle before, saw and understood the use of every wheel and screw so that I can build an engine myself when I am ready. I now read every paragraph in which the word locomotive occurs with greater interest. I find it hard not to laugh a little bit. The image of a curious Thoreau, pencil and notebook in hand, peeking over the shoulder of some sort of annoyed worker who no doubt was just trying to get his work done and not entertain some transcendentalist busybody. But still, it demonstrates that Thoreau was neither scared of nor entirely morally opposed to sort of at the time the most advanced machinery. It is also, in its way, a nice illustration of a theme that ironically we normally associate with Thoreau's nature writings. The degree to which Thoreau valued the unmediated firsthand experience, grasping these machines on his own and understanding how they worked with his own hands. There are plenty of other examples. After all, he brought an axe with him to Walden Pond and bragged that he returned it sharper than he found it. He used scientific instruments carefully. As I'm sure people are well aware, he was obsessive about measuring the temperature with his thermometer and famously, of course, tried to plumb the depths of Walden Ponds. Perhaps the only time I've ever seen a note of material jealousy in Thoreau's journals came in an 1855 entry on his friend Reuben Rice. Noting that Rice had a huge chest of tools that he had spent nearly $3,000 on, Thoreau commented, comparatively speaking, his life is a success, not such a failure as most men's. He gets more out of any enterprise than his neighbors, for he helps himself more and he hires less. If most people became shrunken by their dependence on external tools, Reuben Rice was able to use his chest of tools to seize a greater control over his lives, to rely on others less and to achieve his own ends more. I hope this shows that for Thoreau, the problem was less industrial tools themselves and more how they were used in an economy and a culture that constantly encouraged secondary thinking, obsessing about means and ignoring why we used things, ignoring ends. People adopted tools and machinery unthinkingly, believing they were simply neutral extensions of their will, but soon discovered the very act of relying on a tool, on an extension, like that very often distorted things, bringing with it its own logic implicit in technological modernity, efficiency, calculation, utilitarianism. This is well illustrated in another account that Thoreau gives us of visiting a factory. In this case, it's his friend Sam Barrett's mill. I'm going to put this quote up. Oh, sorry, out of order. Oh, where is the quote? Oh, no, I don't have the quote. I'm sorry. I thought I had this quote. It's okay, I'll just read it. So this is a quote of him visiting Sam Barrett's mill. It says, I was the more pleased with the sight of the trays. This is they're producing sort of trays by hand, because the tools used were so simple, and because they were made by hand, not by machinery. They may make equally good pails, and cheaper as well as faster at the pail factory with the homemade ones, but that interests me less, because the man is partly turned into a machine there himself. In this case, the workman's relation to his work is more poetic. He also shows more dexterity as a man. You come away from the great factory saddened, as if the chief end of man were to make pails. But in the case of the countryman who makes a few by hand on rainy days, the relative importance of human life and of pails is preserved. It's from a journal entry in 1858. So the second trip to a factory, I think, is key. The problem wasn't machinery as much as it was the purpose for which the machinery is being put to use. And you can see it, of course, in this perversion of the Westminster Catechism, which would declare, of course, that man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever, not as it appeared here, that man's chief end was to make cheap consumer goods. Thoreau loved playing with that line. He shows up in Walden as well. Thoreau had appreciated at the locomotive factory the process of learning in a hands-on way the means by which a machine worked. Doing so elevated his own world, giving him insight and appreciation into how railroads worked. And Sam Barrett's workers still maybe seemed to work this way. But this was not, he knew, how most factories operated by 1858. Most valued cheap pails more than they did the good life of their workers. Or perhaps I should rather say, they didn't really value anything at all. Values presume some sort of conscious choice. Instead, they seem to let themselves be dragged along by a logic that they could not control, a logic that mandated ever greater specialization, ever more efficient production, and ever more dehumanized labor. The future belonged to factories that were okay, degrading the 10 hours a day a worker spent at the factory, just so it could produce slightly cheaper consumer goods that, as Thoreau feared, came to value pails more than human life. In a quite literal way, the factory workers were becoming reduced to tools of their tools. As Karl Marx, writing just 10 years earlier, or 14 years earlier, in 1844, had described it, the rule of the person over the person has now become the universal rule of the thing over the person, the product over the producer. Okay. So I'm going to shift for a second now. We're going to come back to Thoreau. I'm going to shift for a second and talk about the anti-slavery moral imagination a little bit. How it links up, I hope to show, how it links up a little bit to what I've been talking about. Abolitionists in New England frequently refer to the people who collaborated with slavery as tools of slavery. It was particularly common language to refer to those who collaborated, the judges, policemen, lawyers who helped return slaves, but it's also frequently deployed against politicians, particularly the hunker wing of the Democratic Party or the cotton wig wing of the Whig Party, politicians who wanted to compromise or in some ways make alliances with the slave South. So I'm just going to give you some examples. As early as 1842, Henry Ingersoll Butterwich asked in wonderment, how was it that a northern-born man can so lower his lofty views of human liberty as to condescend for money to become the tool of a Southern slaveholder is to me perfectly incomprehensible. Theodore Parker, writing to a British Unitarian correspondent, described the fugitive slave law a substance that allows a miserable tool of government to kidnap a man off the streets of Boston. One particularly dramatic example came from Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who had helped lead the charge that had attempted to free Anthony Burns back in 1854. Higginson was widely expected to be arrested in the aftermath. And about a week after the rendition of Burns, he gave a rousing sermon to his Worcester congregation explaining his actions. In one dramatic paragraph, he contrasted the tools that each region used. The North used industrial machinery, while the South used hoes, spades, axes, politicians, and ministers. And thus, in the rousing climax, he imagined the mayor of Boston and the governor of Massachusetts offering the use of the leading Yankee politicians, newspaper editors, and ministers to the planter South. These tools, she gives, Virginia to thee, he cried from his pulpit. His rhetoric also frequently appeared in private. Stick with Higginson for a second. In one very dramatic letter to his childhood friend, Higginson's friend was serving as a U.S. Marshal in Boston, and thus was, in theory, tasked with returning fugitive slaves. Higginson wrote him a letter, pleading with him to resign his position. I ask you, can you, as a man, underlined man, with a reason, a conscience, and a heart, become what the law calls on you to become, the paid tool of another's injustice and cruelty? A surprisingly diverse group deployed the language. One Irish abolitionist complained that too many of his fellow countrymen were the tools of priests and politicians. A group of Black abolitionists in 1849 complained that there were African Americans in Boston willing to play the tool to suit the wishes of those who were opposed to the full enjoyment of our rights. Notably, by the way, all three of these examples include people castigated members of their own community. Language was generally reserved, in other words, for people in the North who were collaborating with slavery, not really for slaveholders themselves. I think this illustrates that in a way, the transcendentalists and abolitionists were the term tool was reserved for those Americans, not really those Americans who were committed racists or considered pro-slavery thinkers. It was more reserved for those who were thoughtless, unwilling to actually think hard about the moral stakes of what they were doing. When you get hold of a man who is a citizen, who feels that before he was a merchant or a mechanic, he was a man, you can reason with him, Moncure Conway had written in 1860. But when you get hold of one who thinks the end and aim of creation was to fill his pocket, then you have got a hold not of a man, but a piece of patent leather or dry goods. It was notable that people like Conway, Thoreau, often seemed less outraged at the committed pro-slavery thinkers, men like George Fitzhugh or John Calhoun, appear relatively infrequently, and were far more outraged at the cowardice of people like Daniel Webster, who theoretically opposed slavery, but kept doing whatever the South wanted. 100 years before Hannah Arendt described Adolf Eichmann as thoughtless, as a banal bureaucrat, unable to grasp the gravity of what he was doing, I think the abolitionists are doing something similar when they describe Northern merchants and politicians and ministers, not as monsters, but as tools, as dry goods, as things incapable of moral agency. And thus, a constant part of abolitionist rhetoric, even before Thoreau embraced it, was appealing to individuals to not act like a tool. Here we go. One good example comes from 1846 in the Chronotype, a feisty anti-slavery paper edited by Elizur Wright. By the way, among the subscribers to the Chronotype was the Emerson family. We know this because in his journal, Emerson said that his family read the vivacious little Chronotype, eat in rebellion with our daily bread. In an early issue, Elizur Wright, who's the editor, announced to his readers, "We have this to say to every individual conscious of a rational soul: be free, be a unit on your own hook, be not made a tool of. If there's anything either of belief or doubt in you, according to which your own will can produce action, act up to it for yourself. Feel free to do so." Being a tool here wasn't just about collaborating with injustice. It was also a sort of loss of agency, in which one lost the ability to act in a sort of self-willed or principled, self-determined way. So you may notice how sort of transcendentalist the anti-slavery Elizur Wright sounds here, and that's not a coincidence, I don't think. Moncure Conway, another a fellow in this circles made this explicit in an 1862 speech. This was a speech critical of the Lincoln administration's, at the time, seeming unwillingness to turn the Civil War into a fight over slavery. Lincoln, Conway suggested, wanted to be a tool of the people, an automaton president. But a great writer has written a book upon representative men, Conway explained. Was any one of them a mere follower of majorities? Was any one of them a mere tool of majorities? Was Plato? Here was a clear transcendentalist sentiment. One could be a tool of capricious or shifting public opinion, or follow Emerson's advice and act in a principled and morally courageous manner. Okay, I don't think I need to belabor the point anymore. Just as Thoreau was horrified by the tendency of modern man to become tools of his tools, so most abolitionists were horrified by the tendency of Northerners to become tools of Southern interests. A deep fear animated the abolitionist crusade, that Northerners were losing their ability to make good moral choices, and they reached for metaphors, tools, and machines to make the case. This language, I believe, of tools tells us something important about the abolitionist imagination, how it relied on a contrast between human agency and the sort of instrumentalism of industrial life on the other hand. And I think I'm going to go to two thinkers in Thoreau's orbit, Theodore Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson, to sort of unpack this a little bit. We'll start with Emerson. Some of you may already have been thinking a little bit about Emerson's American Scholar essay. At the beginning of this canonical essay, of course, Emerson presents us with a ribbon imagery of the inner psychological divisions that can occur in market society. At our best, we are humans with integrity and secure moral essences. Man with a capital M, Emerson, right, describes it, who do certain tasks. We farm, we preach, we sail, we teach. But later, we become so identified with those jobs that we lose our original selfhood and sink into a narrow identification with our tasks. A farmer sees his bushel in his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into farmer instead of man on the farm. We lose the ability to think like a human, and instead can only think like a member of our job. Emerson described the modern American as someone who had suffered amputation, who struts around like so many walking monsters, a good finger, a knack, a stomach. Crucially, these divided and alienated men, people who could only think from within the confines of their job, Emerson described as someone being reduced to the tools that they used. The priest becomes a form, the attorney a statute book, the mechanic a machine, the sailor a rope of a ship. This essay is, among other things, a brilliant critique how the division of labor fractured our intellectual and moral life, leading us to think in narrow and mechanical ways, circumscribed by our careers and our jobs. Now, of course, we can put Emerson's existential anxiety in a real economic context. He was writing in the years of what historians have called the market revolution, the early years of the Industrial Revolution, as railroads, urbanization, proletariatization, and industrialization remade the nation. As Bob Grosch has shown so well, nowhere were these changes felt more intimately than here in Concord, where the sons and daughters of farmers now faced an entirely new economy, a railroad that threw them into competition with national and international markets, demanding a far greater economic specialization, a growing divide between wage workers and capital-owning employees, a consumption of cheap factory-made goods. Of course, there are a number of brilliant and thoughtful analysis of what these economic changes meant for people who experienced it. Karl Marx, of course, has shown how capitalism relied on a constant revolution in the technological base of production. But I think Thoreau would be even more inclined to agree, at least in some ways, with Max Weber, when the German sociologist stressed how the rise of capitalism had profound consequences for how we thought. For Weber, capitalism ultimately elevated what he called the rationality of function above the rationality of reason. On one hand, so the rationality of function is kind of when you're being rational from within a particular role, a particular job, a particular function that you have. You're thinking in a very rational way, like a lawyer, in all the ways a lawyer thinks, or like a policeman in all the ways a policeman thinks. Rationality of reason is a kind of more ultimate, absolute way of thinking. If on the one hand, capitalism encourages means to an end thinking, disenchanted thought that seems unable to consider or address ultimate questions, capitalists prosper when they calculate and optimize, always seeking the most efficient use of their capital and labor, not when they sit and contemplate good or evil or the beauty of a water lily. The victory for technics, the instrumental pursuit of control over nature, and a hollowing out of moral or philosophical thought. Now, Thoreau would not have shared Weber's tragic pessimism. Unlike Weber, Thoreau always held out hope that man could reassert their moral agency, could, in one of his favorite metaphors, trace a river to its source and remind ourselves of the ultimate moral ends for which we live. But Thoreau certainly worried that such moral reasoning was rare and getting rarer. And he agreed that market life seemed to encourage an obsession with the secondary, the instrumental, the means to an end, calculation, not contemplation. As he wrote in a letter to Harrison Otis Blake, men seemed obsessed with trivial affairs, unable to distinguish the necessary and the real. In one 1853 journal entry, he contrasted the indirect and complicated business of trade, in which one satisfies their need by an artificial or complicated method, with the simple and direct person who goes out and chops his own wood. No trade is simple, but always artificial and complex. It postpones life and substitutes death. Okay, I want to now quickly turn to Theodore Parker, and we'll come back to Thoreau a little more. The transcendentalist theologian and anti-slavery activist. Parker, especially in the 1850s, became obsessed with what he called the worlds of matter and the worlds of men. This dichotomy sometimes is the spirit of men, but this dichotomy appears in a number of essays, and most crucially, a series of sermons that he gave in 1857 and 1858 to his music hall congregation in Boston. That series was The Revelation of God and the Worlds of Matter and the Spirit of Men. It would later form the basis of his last book, The World of Matter and the Spirit of Men. So in this sort of dichotomy that he sets up, the world of matter is basically nature in its most sort of disenchanted way possible, operates according to strict Newtonian laws. I'll quote here, it's nature, the world of matter, everything is accomplished with no private, finite will, all is mechanism, brute, involuntary. There, God is the only actor, all else is tool. Nature, everything is tool. But the contrasting world of man was alive, spontaneous, capable of actual human freedom. In the world of man, as Parker writes, man is an actor as well as a tool. He's in part engine, in part also engineer. Humans, in other words, only exercised free will and agency when they were able to transcend being a mere tool in the world of matter. And I want to emphasize how much Parker understood this dichotomy to underwrite his theories of civil disobedience. Let's take his sermon here, The Function and Place of Conscience in Relation to the Laws of Men, given in September 1850, extraordinarily influential in the time period articulation of civil disobedience theory. So given right after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, and obviously written to encourage disobedience of that law. It begins with a surprisingly abstract discussion of the difference, again here, between the natural laws of matter and the laws of spirit. An apple can't not fall to the ground. It must follow the laws of matter. But the best and probably the worst things about humans is that we can decide whether or not to follow the laws of spirit, moral commands that Parker assumed had something like the objectivity and clarity of natural laws. Parker's point was that just as it would be unnatural for Massachusetts to pass a law requiring apples to hover in the air, so governments should not try to pass laws preventing Northerners from following their moral law and offering aid and assistance to innocent slaves. If they were to be free actors and not simply passive tools, they would have to follow their conscience and disobey these man-made laws. Okay, what I hope to show with these sort of analyses of Emerson and Parker is that deep in the anti-slavery and transcendentalist imagination was a fear of internal mechanization, of an excessive naturalism that was coming to control the self, emptying out our capacity for moral agency. A concern that the machine age was taking over the inner self. If we go back to Emerson for one quick second, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means for how we understand abolitionism, hopefully. Horace Greeley, the journalist from New York City, once told a story about Emerson, where he got in a debate with Emerson about the nature of slavery. What is slavery, Emerson asked Greeley? Is it not our using man as a chattel, a thing? Making some other body do service for us? Let us resolve that we will never use a human being as in this any way less than ourselves. And from that moment, abolition is carried so far as we are concerned, and also to some extent so far as our influence extends. Aside for a second Emerson's tremendous faith, the power of individual action. But we can kind of appreciate that Emerson is tying the anti-slavery imagination to a really broad critique of lots of forms of inequality and dehumanization. Now, that slavery relies on dehumanization, a sort of depersonalization of the enslaved, seems at some level quite intuitive or obvious, I think, to us. But it's worth pointing out there's actually a very long strand of anti-slavery thought that didn't quite make that critique of slavery. So it is well known, for instance, that Adam Smith opposed slavery for both practical and moral reasons. Give him his credit, he's an early and important voice against slavery. But the explanation he gave, that slavery violated a property right that mankind has in their own self, would often be taken up by historians as the only or the main reason people opposed slavery. One of the most prominent historians today of the anti-slavery movement, someone I have deep respect for, argues that the philosophical starting point for the anti-slavery critique was the natural right of self-ownership, a fundamental premise of bourgeois society. In this worldview, there's no problem with the self becoming a thing. What matters is the property rights of the owner of the thing as self be respected. This course is consistent with a broad historiographical assumption that abolitionists were intentionally or unintentionally part of the advance guard of industrial capitalism, helping to normalize the moral underpinnings of capitalism. Now, as the example of Adam Smith suggests, this current of thought did exist. There were abolitionists, particularly in Great Britain, that broadly speaking opposed slavery because they viewed it as in conflict with the logic of the market. In this vision, slavery was wrong because people ought to be free to dispose of their property as they wanted to, including the property they owned in their own body and in their own labor. What I really want to emphasize is this was not the critique that Thoreau and his friends in the radicals in New England tended to make. They drew from a very different strand of anti-slavery thought that posited nearly the opposite. Its starting point was a denial of the metaphor of property in man, claiming that the very origin of slavery was the immoral attempt to apply the logic of things and property to the human self. In this critique, slavery was wrong because it thought to confound the thing and the person. A person and a thing were fundamentally, radically different sorts of beings and should never be confused. Perhaps the most influential source here was the 1827 legal treatise, A Sketch of the Laws Relating to Slavery by the groundbreaking anti-slavery lawyer George Stroud. Moving through the laws that governed slavery in the South, Stroud summarized them into what he called the cardinal principle of slavery, that the slave is not to be ranked among sentient beings, but among things. Picking up on this definition, which he quoted over and over and over again, Charles Sumner, the radical senator from here in Massachusetts, wrote, a very, very evocative line, as out of the small egg crawls forth the slimy scaled reptile crocodile, so out of the simple definition crawls forth the whole slimy, scaly reptile monstrosity by which a man is changed into a chattel, a person is converted into a thing, a soul is transmitted into merchandise. This language of personhood versus thing became central to abolitionist discourse. The original subtitle, for instance, to Uncle Tom's Cabin, had originally been The Man That Was a Thing. The editors made her change it. It's a bit hard to see here, but this is the sort of the title page of I Bonded to Freedom, Douglas. There's this line here from the British poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I'm going to read this because it's hard to see there. By a principle essential to Christianity, a person is highlighted, is eternally differenced from a thing. So the idea of a human being necessarily excludes the idea of property in that being. Thoreau, of course, jumped on this definition. In a journal entry, Thoreau criticized those who think slavery was only in the South. Talk about slavery, Thoreau wrote, it is not the peculiar institution of the South. It exists wherever men are bought and sold, wherever a man allows himself to be made a mere thing or a tool and surrenders his inalienable right of reason and conscience. Now, there's an irony here, of course, that Thoreau was hinting at in this journal entry, which that it wasn't the slaves in the reality who were becoming the things, it was the defenders of the system who were becoming things. Slaveholders and the defenders sought to use the enslaved as things, as chattel. But as scholarship has proven over and over again, enslaved people resisted this. They formed families and communities. They created religious traditions. They resisted their owners in day-to-day ways. And most relevantly for Thoreau, they ran away, exerting agency over their life. If slavery sought to dehumanize its victims, to turn them into a mere thing, and then use them for someone else's purposes, it was never successful entirely. In fact, the handful of runaway slaves that Thoreau met generally impressed him. He described one of them as self-reliant, surely one of the greatest transcendentalist compliments you could give. In other words, it was not the slaves who fell into thinghood, it was the craven northern men who had lost the ability to think morally, who had surrendered their inalienable rights of reason and conscience and allowed themselves to be pushed this way and that way by the slaveholders in the South, all in their desperate quest for wealth and social peace. It was the moderate northerner who had in a way become, more than anyone else, the tool of their tools. Okay, so wrapping up here, I hope maybe all of this context helps set the stage for perhaps the most famous image of machinery in Thoreau's writing, his description in Civil Disobedience of the machinery of government. If the injustice has a spring or a pulley or a rope or a crank exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say, break the law, let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. The nation of tools have become one great machine of injustice. On one hand, I cannot but think Thoreau leafing through Bigelow's Elements of Technology as he wrote these lines. Here's the page on friction from that book we know you read. If nothing else, it demonstrates Thoreau's real familiarity with how modern machines work. Of course, more so, I hope the conversation today has helped to elucidate Thoreau's thinking here. If, as he writes a couple pages earlier, the mass of men serve the state thus not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies, here again he contrasts machinery with humanity. Imagine true human agency and freedom. It's functioning almost like a piece of sand or grit, working its way into the machine of injustice, wearing it down and breaking it. Okay, we've gone through a lot today, from mechanics journals to Max Weber to Charles Sumner. I hope I have shown that Thoreau was in deep conversation with radical abolitionists with whom he learned from and in turn influenced, and in particular, that both were deeply interested in what defined our humanity in an era in which certain types of political injustice, technological developments, and capitalist exploitation seemed to thingify humans. They worried, as Emerson did, that the division of labor and specialization reduced men's ability to think in a morally coherent way. And they were obsessed, as Theodore Parker shows, with distinguishing the human from the artificial and material. Thoreau, along with his friends and allies, sought to preserve some humanity in the face of these developments. They sought to do so by asking us why we use technology and material things, and we demanded that we self-consciously use them in ways that elevate our life, not that reduce us to their status, to preserve our human and moral control over the unwilled forces of technological advancement. As I was putting the final touches on this talk together this morning, I saw in the New York Times that Elon Musk has trained his AI chatbot on a bunch of right-wing Twitter feeds. And now, apparently unintentionally, though who knows these days, this chatbot is praising Adolf Hitler and seemingly defending the Holocaust. The slogan at the same time for Peter Thiel's Palantir, this is the company that's currently being tasked with developing these giant databases of immigrants to facilitate mass deportations, is software that dominates, hardly even trying to hide its goals. I think for me, at least, the fact that so many of these Silicon Valley CEOs have revealed their kind of fascist sympathies have made the technological future seem much more ominous than maybe it had. Less helpful and charming robots like R2-D2 and C-3PO, and more AI chatbots programmed to praise genocide. But even before these developments, it can often feel like we live in a world that values economic progress and technological developments as ends into themselves, regardless of whether they make our life better. in which, as Thoreau noted in The Great Factory, the chief end of life is cheap commodities, not a good life. I think as long as that's true, I think people will keep coming back to Thoreau for answers about how to live. Thank you.
We'll take questions. I'll repeat them. Maybe I'll repeat them. Or you can repeat them. I can repeat them. Let's have this. You can just lots to think about. Thank you so much. So, what are our questions?
First of all, I think your talk was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Appreciate all the effort that went into it.
Thank you.
I guess the question in my mind, or what is an unexplored or seldom explored part of it, is how do you get from the one to the other? You know, from treating people as instruments, thinking of everything in utilitarian ways. How do you get from there to a more expansive view of human nature? And you know, this is the transcendentalist. You know, the distinction between the understanding and the reason. It's one thing to make the analysis, but how do you get from the one to the other? And I think that's what really Walden is all about. He talks about contemplation and solitude and nature and so on. So I think the kind of unmentioned part of it is get from the one to the other.
I wish I knew the exact answer. It's a great question.
Do you want to try to summarize the question? Or
sure.
I'll give it a shot. So thank you, Barry. So in short, how do you go from this understanding of humans as being instrumentalized to this action living in a different way? Is that your?
I mean, this is a problem for all of us. Get caught up in the daily affairs and politics and everything, but kind of lose sight of the bigger picture. You know.
So how do you get how do you change how people live and how they? Yeah, great.
I mean, this is a great question. I'm sure everyone will have a slightly different answer to that. I've always really loved the imagery. You know, he ends Walden with "the sun always rises." There's a chance for renewal and regrowth. You know, it's certainly true that I think Thoreau's answer would be very individual, right? Thoreau's answer, at least, would be a kind of like the self has to figure out a way on the self's own terms to live in a more principled way. I'm not sure that is always the most politically efficacious answer, but it is a real one, a good one. Yeah. I don't know. I wish I had a great answer for that. I feel like that's the $1 million question.
So I was thinking something similar as you presented. So one view is slavery is wrong because it extracts the labor from people without their consent, forces them to do the labor, and then takes the fruit. Second is slavery is wrong because it makes man into a thing. Deprives human beings of their First is one or the other more radical politically in the anti-Darwin context. The second question is, you discuss this almost entirely in secular terms. But surely, Parker and certainly Emerson would have said, can't make man into a thing because man has a soul. And so I wonder if you might expand on the religious grounding of the idea of slavery as antithetical to human existence.
It's a lot to summarize. So it's those two theories of abolitionism, one that you're extracting labor without consent, and the other that you're treating humans as things. Which is more radical, and what do we do with the idea of the soul as a religious framework in this era?
Since you said it so well, that in fact, the second definition you seem more radical
Mhm.
but it also diffuses the political attack against slavery in the antebellum society.
Yeah.
And likewise, the former might seem more conservative, because if you solve the economic problem, then you can go on to have an unequal society, but just without slavery, and we get into a coercion altogether.
Yeah. So let me start with the second question. Absolutely, there's no question that this is going to be understood for many. I mean, Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? On Tom's Cabin, there's no question there's a Christian imagery is absolutely defined part of this. One of the central texts I see for this is by this sort of underappreciated abolitionist Beriah Green, who wrote a text called the Chattel Principle, which this term gets taken up by a lot of other people as this is the core of what slavery is. Walter Johnson, the historian, has used it a lot. The point of the book is he's contrasting the chattel principle with the Christian principle. And the point of the book is he's responding to sort of the problem in the 1830s that a lot of evangelical abolitionists have, which is that the Bible doesn't explicitly condemn slavery in a kind of in the sort of clear language they want to. And so what he does is he says, well, okay, like, yes, you can find this or that line in the Old Testament that seems to be okay with slavery, but the principle of Christianity is clearly, as you said, a kind of the agency and freedom of the soul. And that principle, the Christian principle, has to stand forever in contrast with this logic of thingification of the sort of the chattel principle. So 100% it has origins in this thing. I mean, you can Thoreau's exact relationship to Christianity is complicated, but he's certainly not some sort of reductive atheist in any sort of way. He clearly believed in something like a soul, and I think similarly embraces this logic. On the first question, I think the book that probably started me on the path for all of this is Stout and Lynn's The Intellectual Origins of American Radicalism, which is this fantastic, really short little book that was published in the late 60s. And in it, he has, sorry? Stout and Lynn. He was sort of famous for, he led the historians against the Vietnam War and was basically kind of pushed out of Yale because of his anti-war activism, among other things. Anyway, so The Intellectual Origins of American Radicalism is a very short book. And he has this analysis of the Declaration of Independence in it, in which he says something like, there's actually multiple ways you can oppose slavery, and it turns out it matters a great deal which one you do. And he makes the case, whether this is true or not, he makes the case that Jefferson was drawn on these dissenting Christian writers from the 1760s and 1780s, sorry, yeah, 1760s, 1770s, who had defined certain sets of rights as alienable and certain sets of rights as inalienable. And the most important part of the inalienable rights were those rights of conscience, right? Because you couldn't ever alienate. You can alienate your property, but you can't alienate your conscience. You can't alienate your political right? Your political ideas. Even if you pay me $100 to vote some other way, you can't change what's in my head, right? You can't change the fact that I am able to come up with my own ideas about what I think is right and wrong. And so the argument is that this is the kind of core, one of the core principles that undergirds a kind of certain opposition to slavery. So taken from that, I do think there's a way in which this second aspect, the second critique of slavery, I'm not sure it always is more radical in every situation, but it does offer a greater sense of the not just what's wrong with slavery, but how people who aren't slave owners ought to act. Because it puts a greater emphasis on how someone, how Thoreau and Emerson and folks who don't own slaves, that they also have a sort of concrete direct, they're not, themselves exploiting slave labor, but that they actually have an obligation to get involved in the anti-slavery movement, which they, eventually do. I'm not sure that totally answers that question, but I think it's that's what best I've got for now.
We go all the way to the back, maybe.
So, everything that you seem to say very nicely aligns with Kant's categorical.
Yeah.
As a means to within, actually is never simply as a means to within. So, which allows you to employ someone to treat them as a means to within, as long as you also treat them as a person, right? At the same time. So, and of course, the transcendentalists take their name from. How come I never heard any mention of Kant?
Well,
because I mean, like, so much thought lying so nicely. And yet they never really acknowledge it. And why Kant says we ought to treat somebody as an entity itself. He's arguments. Right? And so it would bolster their case if they had borrowed from someone and discussed them. So does Kantian thought pop up in any of these people, that you're talking about?
Marx and Weber weren't ponderous Germans enough. No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely, 100%. That Kant is in deep ways, I think, the background. I think the thing that confuses it slightly is that very few of these folks read Kant themselves. They often got it sort of filtered through these other thinkers, particularly Coleridge is a major source of Kantian knowledge, particularly the sort of reason, understanding distinction that came up earlier. And so my sense is, with a possible exception of Theodore Parker, who I think probably really did sit down and really work his way through the various critiques, it didn't, the sort of average abolitionist, I think, was unlikely to have really studied it in the ways that, like, a scholar or something would want us to. But I think you're 100% correct to point out that the sort of notion of dignity, that you don't treat a person like a thing, is at the core here. I've been using this term thingification from I think from Martin Luther King, who uses this term frequently as a kind of way to describe what segregation does, what slavery did, right? Then he uses the example that both a slaveholder and a sharecropper, or the landlord in the sharecropping situation, refer to people as hands, right? Like, they literally referring to their workers just by the sort of physical task they did. I've always thought King is a sort of brilliant popularizer of very complex ideas, because I think he's taken this idea from Kant and from Hegel of this kind of reification, it's things like this, and he's taken it, but he's using it in a language that everyday American in the 1950s is much more likely to understand, and I think hit home than the kind of abstraction. Anyway, so I 100% think it's behind the foundation there.
Bunch of hands. Richard, then Lois, and then Lisa.
So one of the main arguments that slaveholders used at the time was that they were doing the Christian thing by having these people in bondage. Do we know if the more radical ministers like Parker or Higginson had any kind of a response to that sort of thinking? Or what they would have said in response to that sort of thing?
I mean, Higginson does have a blank on the line here. I shouldn't try to quote fully from memory, but something like, the Bible is one of the great bulwarks of slavery in the South, right? Because exactly as you suggested, it's one of the primary justifications that many of the slave owners used, and it's one of the sort of, if you're a theologian, if you're really, really interested in a literal description of the Bible, it is a problem for the abolitionists that there's not a clear and explicit language in the Bible saying slavery is everywhere and always evil. So they're very much aware of it. They're very involved in fighting with it. And I think part of what makes people like Parker more capable of being so opposed to slavery is exactly that he is completely, him and Higginson, they're not interested in biblical literalism. They've completely moved past that. So they're perfectly happy to say what matters is the spirit of this text. What matters is the kind of abstract, the permanent, ethos of Christianity, not what it says in Deuteronomy here, or what it says, in this or that thing. And so I think that they're able to sort of pull out what they see as the most important moral values from it.
Because Parker didn't necessarily think that you needed to have the Bible and have Christianity.
No. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and even Parker, I think, yeah, people would debate about whether he's, like, certainly there are some Christians who wouldn't even call Parker, I think, part of it, but regardless, in the time period, he's 100. They've moved beyond that. In fact, Parker even has some line where he says something like, "Christians make an idol out of the Bible." They treat the Bible as somehow more important than the sort of spirit that it ought to represent. So they're very much. I think it gives them more flexibility than if you're Charles Hodge at Princeton and you're really committed to a kind of biblical literalism in this period, then you're often more conservative on slavery in the time period. Yeah.
So one of the things that's really sobering about what you're presenting here is that it reminds us that for all the conversation about abolition and pro-slavery, that the entire body of enslaved people are the fuel, the catalyst for this conversation, but they're not present.
Okay.
So we could have this whole conversation about the legislative moral imagination, but it doesn't invoke, turn to, cite, refer to speeches, sermons, freedom suits, lawsuits, constitutions, the entire systematic institutional resistance that you see in African Americans, enslaved Africans who become Americans in the 18th to 19th century. When you read that quote about from Higginson and the Worcester sermon, it was lovely. I'm going to go back and kind of really piece it out, but it was remarkable because he talks about the North uses tools and then the South uses, and it was an entire list. But nowhere in that list was actually a reference to the bodies of the people, where the people were the engines, right? So I'm wondering, how might your assessment approach of a really front-facing, deliberate focus and vocation circling around of African American critique, evaluation, philosophy of labor, of production, of even technical innovation, because we also know that African Americans were inventing tools that both facilitate enslavement and its profits and also increase their labor. So I'm just wondering, if you were to pivot a bit more, how might a focus on them, and who might you invoke and go to put in conversation with Thoreau as he's thinking about this, and as self-emancipated people are making their way through, because they want to create a world in which their labor changes them.
Yeah, that's a great question. And we absolutely know that. Oh, sure.
I think it's right point. So, so Lois asked, striking how much of this conversation is among white activists, writers talking about other white people, and the African American world is not as central as it is striking action. So how would it look if we thought about them with African American people at the center of this?
And also they're thinking in the traditions of history and evidence of their intervention and
Thank you.
So thanks, the great question. I think probably the figure who I would first start with, who I used a great deal in my book, probably is William C. Nell, who is this African American activist in Boston, helps lead a number of the organizations dedicated to protecting fugitives in Boston. So this is sort of well known for if someone shows up in Boston, recently escaped from the South, he's one of the people you go to sort of say, how do I get a job? William Cooper Nell. And sort of fascinating figure. Among other things, he actually has a number of close connections to some of these transcendentalists. So he worshipped at Theodore Parker's church, and actually rises in has a sort of position there. He's actually hired by Emerson's, so the Town and Country Club, which is this club that Emerson founds in 1848, I think. It's this kind of literary social club in which a number of the kind of leading lights of both reform and kind of literary Boston gather. He works for them and attends their meetings. He attends conversations with that A. Bronson Alcott holds. And even after the Civil War, is writing letters saying, he attended a picnic and ran into Emerson there. And so he's very much on the, in some of these circles, attending some of these things. So he's a great figure for uniting these two worlds. He's deeply involved in the day-to-day protection of fugitives, and he's deeply involved in he's really interested in transcendentalism, I think, in both the kind of political aspects of it, but also in the sort of less political aspects of it. It seems like the fact that he attends Parker's church suggests that he's got a kind of theological interest in a sort of more liberal forms of Christianity. And of course, we know Douglas was a close reader of Emerson. We know that he, they had interactions as well. That Douglas would quote Emerson in speeches, quote him in newspapers. So there's by all we know that Thoreau met African Americans at Concord, was very aware of their presence. So that's the kind of I think the particulars help get at some of these things. In some of the sort of more abstract things, I'm probably something I need to think a little bit more about is in terms of the language of tools, though, as I did mention, it does show up in African-American language as well. So there are African-Americans activists deploying this language as well, sometimes against people that they view in their community as not being active enough or not being radical enough. I mean, one of the things I can't help but think of is that we know that one of the main forms of everyday resistance on the slave South was breaking tools, was the kind of deliberate attempt to slow down the plantation economy by, breaking a shovel or breaking a hoe or something like this in order to sort of deliberately slow down production. So I think that there's, this is all there. Hope I answered that, guys. It's a really good question, and I think there's, I'm sure there's more I can be doing, but I want to keep thinking about that. Thanks.
Actually, just an idea as an answer to Pierre's question.
Yeah.
Let's break some rules.
Yeah.
Matthew Stewart, in his book
Yeah.
on Douglas and Parker,
Yeah.
points out that abolitionism was a very small minority.
Yeah. Yeah.
He points out that not only in the South but the North, validated slavery. Paul said, "Slaves, obey your masters."
Yeah.
Now, I guess what I would be interested to know, and maybe you know something about it, is what we know how the white Southerners and Northerners were reading the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
How were African Americans reading the Bible?
Yeah.
Were they reading the same Bible? I don't think so. But I really haven't read a lot about the Bible in the African American tradition and how it responded to the issue of slavery.
Was a great deal of emphasis on different aspects of the Bible, right? So in this, a lot of slave theology, but then also early sort of African American theology in the North, focus on things like the exodus of out of Egypt, right? A kind of sort of obvious way, a kind of people becoming free, leaving bondage, right? So there's, of course, there are stories in the Bibles that can be very appealing to people who are enslaved or thinking like that. It is interesting that in Boston, some of the figures I've been thinking about, I think are not. I mean, Douglas also is not a. I think Matthew Stewart exaggerates a little bit Douglas's rejection of religion. He wants to treat Douglas and Parker as just almost completely being hostile to Christianity, and I think I see them much more as kind of, they're liberal Christians in the tradition of folks who think that the Bible ought to be taken metaphorically. They're not, in my mind, they're not as hostile as in a sort of absolute way as I think some of the German thinkers that he wants to put them in conversation with. Anyways, but so I think that they're, you know, so people like Douglas and William Cooper Nell and some of these other folks are, yeah, again, they're not interested in, for the most part, Parson. Oh, you know, what's the story on Onesimus? You know, Paul says, "Go back to your master." You know, there are these little stories in the Bible that seem to suggest that that slavery is okay. There is, I suppose, a strand of evangelical Christianity, evangelical abolitionists that are really parsing the Bible back and forth. I see the sort of radical Garrisonians as their attitude of the Bible as being very similar to the attitude of the Constitution. We'll take what we can take from it, but we're not going to like get in a fight about. We're not going to get in a fight about, you know, what this clause means or what this, you know, book in the Bible means. We know what we think, and we think we're pretty sure we're right about it. You know.
So the right for reading and,
I'm not sure it's that. I'm not sure it's that simple, but yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And I'm wanting to go like the court cases surrounding freedom.
Okay.
That, you know, if you operated, you know, before that, and perhaps, or if all these people who in going into their court cases and see what testimony they might have had and said, and I also kind of want to go to, really and just see what they're saying about the institution, whether it's really visible in the line or between lines. And I think that would add some richness to, you know, pre-discussion and how many people, like in Massachusetts, you know, he started slavery here, like, what, 1638? So like 150 years later, 1783, like how are people emancipating themselves? What is the question and discussion that they're having?
Yeah.
And what might even be happening in your South Native? And you know, what are people saying that is influencing, you know, here in New Hampshire, who live like right around the corner, parents in laws, from where some of these conversations might be at. So
that's a great question. I mean, there's a wonderful book by Chris Cameron, that now I'm blanking on the name of, about African-American, early African-American abolitionism in Massachusetts, 1770s, 1780s, 1790s, much of which is related to kind of Christian sensibility, but also they're also part of the kind of natural right language that is flown around the American Revolution, both responding to and sometimes help creating that discourse, sometimes helping to aim it at slavery in a way that the white revolutionaries don't want to, right? Many of the white revolutionaries have a kind of natural rights are great, but don't want to think too hard about what that means on the ground. And I think often you do have, and we know this, the court cases are great examples. The various petitions that arise, not just in Massachusetts, but New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, in which African Americans are taken, you know, the language of the founding fathers, sometimes quite explicitly quoting from people like Jefferson and saying, wait a minute, this isn't just about you, you know, this is about us too. And this is like this, if you take this seriously, if you're gonna take seriously what we're saying to the king, then this means a change in how New England operates as well. So absolutely, I think that's a great way to keep thinking about it. Yeah.
In 1780, Massachusetts adopted a state constitution that contains the language of all the free people. And that prompted a lot of enslaved people to actually take their enslavement to court. Yeah. This happened so much there was a name for it, freedom suits. And they won. Most famous one is Walker, but there's also Elizabeth Freeman. And between 1780 and 1800, enough of these suits succeeded that slavery became no longer sustainable in Massachusetts. But there was never a constitutional amendment or a law passed against slavery. Just it was enslaved people themselves who took that into their hands and caused it to end.
No, and it's a fascinating story of how I think a language and ideas of you know, natural rights, liberty and freedom for all that is being articulated by mostly the white population in the colonies, sometimes by slaveholders in the colonies, and they don't necessarily want the people who are first saying these things and are putting it into the Massachusetts Constitution. It's not clear they want to abolish slavery, but then that's taken up by people below them who are able to use it and say, oh, actually, we're going to hold you to what you said. We're going to hold you to your own principles in a way that actually turns out to be really powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
How many, and at what point were persons who were enslaved allowed to learn to read? If you can't read, then where are you gonna, how are you gonna argue with these philosophies except for what you might hear?
Yeah. Well, never in the South. In fact, there's a really interesting case, and during while slavery existed, there's a really interesting case I'm reading about this in my second book in 1862. So the first parts of the South to be occupied are the Sea Islands, sort of on the outskirts of Georgia and South Carolina and stuff like this. And so when the Civil War begins, Abraham Lincoln is really, really committed to the notion that this doesn't really change anything. The laws in the South stay in effect. Like this is a kind of insurrection of individual people who are committing crimes. This isn't anything else. So when the Union Army goes south, they're told you must obey all the laws in the states you're in. Okay, so the masters have all fled the Sea Islands. The Union Army is in control, and there's a couple of actually Massachusetts folks who were sent down to help assist with this process. And one of them starts a school because that's starts a school and literally is just saying, okay, like the formerly enslaved can learn to read. The Union General has to shut it down because he says, well, we're supposed to obey the laws of North Carolina, so we can't. And this causes this huge uproar. It's the middle of the Battle of Seven Pines. Charles Sumner hears this, that the Union Army is shutting down schools. And he rushes to find Abraham Lincoln, who's like at the War Department trying to find out, what's going on with the war. And he's bothering Lincoln about this. And, Lincoln at first is really angry because he's just interested in the war at this point. And finally he kind of softens and they sort of settle on a thing in which basically the Union Army, the commander, this guy Stanley, agrees to say, okay, I'm gonna, I was misunderstood. I'll let the schools go on. And just resigning because this guy is this kind of racist Union commander. But it's basically, as you're saying, anyways, the point of it, as you're saying, is absolutely like until emancipation, there are no legal schools for African Americans in the South. That doesn't mean that African Americans didn't learn to read. I mean, Frederick Douglass is a great example of someone who did learn to read. He sort of did it through clandestine methods. And he's certainly not alone, but it's obviously very, very difficult, which is partly why when emancipation happens, one of the first and most important aspirations of so many of the freed people is exactly to have access to these schools that were so impossible to get beforehand. I should say even in the North, I mean, the North is better, but not. It also sees education for African Americans as a real threat. There's a case in New Hampshire, the Noyes Academy. It's a really interesting situation. A number of it's kind of some well-meaning anti-slavery types set up a school in New Hampshire and say it's going to be interracial. We're going to allow for African Americans as well. A couple African Americans from New York City, including Alexander Crummell and Henry Highland Carnett, go up there. They're there for a couple of weeks, and the local folks in New Hampshire just get outraged and drag the school into the swamp, destroy it, and the school is just mob destroyed. A similar case in Connecticut where a mob just burns down and destroys a school that tries to have interracial education. So there's a real sense, not just among slaveholders, but even among a lot of racist whites in the North, that education for African Americans is really dangerous, and they're really doing what they can to stop it. It's really remarkable how it's a way in which you can tell what challenges power by what people are so eager to prevent happening, right? The fact that slave owners were so adamant at preventing education in the South for African Americans, I think is a good evidence of how dangerous that would have been to the institution of slavery had it been allowed. Yeah.
Peter, your stamina is impressive here. We can take a couple more questions, and then we'll try to start our music interlude a bit earlier if we can. We get a couple more if you have.
Just on the very last topic.
Yeah.
dangerous for African Americans and immigrated.
Yeah.
Education. Can you suggest any other titles or places to look for more?
There's been some great works on higher ed. Ebony and Ivory, this book about the complicity of a lot of institutions, like my home institution, Princeton, in slavery, but also Harvard, Yale, a lot of these institutions in which would allow slaveholding students to bring slaves with them that received significant donations. I mean, Theodore Parker said, going to Harvard makes you more likely to support slavery than oppose it. You know, there's this real sense that they fired abolitionist professors, the real sense of the kind of complicity of a lot of the higher institutions of higher ed with slavery. Hilary Moss has written a great book on Hilary Moss, and I'm so bad at remembering the names of books on the top, but has written a great book about some of the fights over trying to secure Black education in the early 19th century. And Elizabeth McHenry has written a great book on literary societies and sort of, because one of the sort of the solutions that a number of African Americans would settle on is essentially like creating their own lyceums, schools, their own sort of self-help sounds like sounds like it's denigrating, you know, so it doesn't say it's taking it seriously, but essentially ways for sort of, you know, urban African Americans, some of whom had escaped from slavery, some of whom had grown up in the North, but all of whom often received poor educations to educate themselves. And so there's really interesting and exciting ways in which they would bring in lecturers, have each other lecture to each other, have a library that they would, you know, lend in libraries, things like this. Actually, in my first book, wrote a little bit about the Adelphic Union, which is this literary organization here in Boston, actually headed by significantly by William Cooper Nell. It was kind of had a library, had sort of debating, you know, they debate topics, but then primarily it was a lecture series, kind of a lyceum in the same way that Concord would have a lyceum and you know, all these different towns would have lyceums. But because so many of the lyceums in New England were segregated, wouldn't allow African Americans to come, this was a sort of a way that they could have their own, invite people themselves. And they actually invited a lot of transcendentalists. This is one of the things that really interested me. So people like William Henry Channon, like Theodore Parker would come and address this. Charles Sumner, actually, I don't know if you call Sumner a transcendentalist, but of this world, would come and address these lyceums. So yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. Yeah.
Lois and then Dennis?
I just wanted to follow up on your question as well, because somebody like Wrzbicki, 1773, fluent not only in whatever languages she came with, but English, Greek, Latin. So there's a difference between what is legal and what monies are proportionate to and what is actually done. And then also the idea too that enslaved Africans have rights and they are fully ordered individuals. So the case of Abdul Rahman was enslaved, is a Moorish prince enslaved in Natchez, makes his way up, contracts to get his freedom and comes on this tour to Boston at one point. But it's his translation of verses of the Quran in a newspaper printing shop in Natchez that then you know English, but how do you know this? How do you know? Let me tell you. So it's that kind of what is visible literacy, what is visible literacy practice. There's so many letters between Whitley and Wilbur Tanner. So it's there, the evidence is there. It's just rarely it's educational institutions and policies pushing back on investing in African American education and American education.
Yeah, just a quick comment. Thank you for starting out digital machines and tools. I attended a well-known technical school quite a while ago in Cambridge, and when I was a young man there, we referred to each other as tools. And if we thought somebody was playing the game too well, they were a real tool. And we did all see ourselves as part of this corporate industrial complex. And that was right when the Vietnam War was warming up. And so everything you mentioned about the vocabulary of starting machining tools just struck me. Old heart.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously, I'm thinking about the the famous the free speech and the Mario right speech and at Berkeley, right, where it's similar, throw your body on the machine, right, the kind of like that imagery shows up a ton in the New Left. Yeah, absolutely. I think it has a real. I think this. Not I mean, Thoreau. We know Thoreau has a renaissance in the 60s in the New Left, but I think a lot of this sort of critique of kind of technocracy and critique of a kind of heartless industrialism, super important in the New Left as well. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
That's what I was going to mention before, is that I think that the way not to be a tool is to live the life you imagine. Right? So it's the exact opposite of becoming a mechanized machine. And we see it in ghosting and other things that are starting to happen as people are pushing back against that sort of industrial model.
Yeah. That's a good way to say it, yeah.
In his journal, Thoreau writes about he doesn't want people to become rusty tools.
Yeah. Oh, I wish I had that quote. It's a wonderful one. It's not just a tool, it's a rusty tool. It's it's even worse. Yeah.
I was just going to say that the question of literacy education in slavery north and south is really pretty complicated. In the 18th century, there were grade schools being set up by the Church of England up and down the colonies, and Williamsburg, Virginia, that William Mary had recently discovered and restored the grade school window. And we know pretty well now that the mode of instruction was no different for enslaved or free black pupils than it would have been for white people for the same. Likewise, in the New Republic and much of the 19th century, there have been a number of southern states, slave states, that still reading to be taught, they're not writing, but writing before the facts. And it's also up and down the window. Nat Turner, others say rebellion produces reactions among whites that we can crack that. Then they're right. It misses, I think, something important. Not to see that, you can't just start with, it was white racism, therefore, white racism played itself out in form in the history of a half century or whatever. There's white racism, but there's also conflicting politics of white, the ups and downs of the degree of slavery was, everything was enforced, making it, I won't think, just utterly confusing, especially in slavery. Because nobody's saying, hey, these shoes are wrong. But without recognizing the diversity of laws and topics of law, we can't get at probably even more painful and difficult the situation.
If I could shamelessly plug an article I wrote, which is probably a pretty boring article, but it's about, I was really interested in the wake of the Haitian Revolution. Haitian Revolution, the first great self-emancipated, revolution of people of color in the Western Hemisphere. And there's obviously the vast majority of the formerly enslaved in Haiti didn't have education. So one of actually the first priorities is setting up a school system. And there's this Prince Saunders, who's a folk, he's actually born in, I think, Colchester, Connecticut, ends up in Boston for a while, like 1813, 1814, 1815, around this period, ends up going down to Haiti and helps Henry Christophe, who's the kind of king of part of Haiti at this time, setting up a school system on the Lancastrian method, which is this kind of would have been probably what would have been taught in a lot of schools here as well, in which kind of the older kids are supposed to teach the younger kids. You kind of pass down knowledge, and it kind of it works well in a system in which you have relatively few teachers and relatively it's like it maximizes the kind of creates a pyramid in which the sort of teacher can teach older kids, who can teach the younger kids, and kind of pass it down like that. So anyways, so this is not the slave South. This is the post-emancipation Haiti, but it's a great.
Wow, Peter, thank you so much.